carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and
Welcome back to the Virginia History Podcast. In the last episode, I summarized economic events leading up to and influencing European colonization. Let's pick up where I left off and focus our attention upon how those conditions affected Virginia. The common 16th and 17th century European was plagued by heavy taxes, rents, constant war, ever-changing landlords, intermittent disease, and any other artificial state control possible, including the constant religious wars which forced the peasant to change his religious affiliation as each new wind blew through town. New opportunities could be had in many of the rapidly growing townships. Those opportunities, however, quickly vanished after merchants and guilds sought newly sponsored state protection. Thus, the economic boom soon turned to an increasingly stagnant depression, such a depression that spurred the sufferers to take unprecedented chances to find a better life, even if death was an almost certainty. These plagued peoples were seeking a change, a revolution. Jamestown's story is a confluence of events, ideas, life, and death. It grew out of both the state desire to overpower and destroy other states, but it also grew out of the emerging medieval serfs' desire to make a better living. The New World promised at least an attempt at a new life, but that chance still had to run through the state apparatus. For would-be Virginia settlers, the state-sponsored route was the London Company, better known as the Virginia Company in later years. England, as was the case with most other European nations, claimed to own the land. Thus, English settlers had to gain crown permission before settling land they'd never seen. This is a key issue, perhaps not for immediate concern, in American history. Would the government still own the claimed land, or would incoming settlers be allowed to have their own private property? Jamestown's early failures would hinge upon this issue. Indeed, events leading up to and following Bacon's Rebellion, up to the Revolutionary War, Constitutional Conventions, and Civil War, all stem from this major question. For the time being, however, the 17th century serf believed European feudalism could at least be exchanged for something better by risking his life across the Atlantic Ocean. King James I granted the Virginia Charter on April 10, 1606. Involved merchants formed the company along English mercantilist traditions in that land and commerce would be governed by crown policy. This way the monarch was happy and the merchants could make a profit as well. Crown policy was based upon how the English handled the nearby Irish colonial project. The English completely defeated Irish rebels by 1603, and the early plantation system became a government institution dominating the countryside. England's forces had destroyed much land during the conquest, and the plantation system was meant to repair the destruction. But plantations required people to work the land, and the English granted these new domains to wealthy lords, who then found cheap labor by taking England's unruly vagabonds across the Irish Sea to work on the plantations. It was feudalism repackaged, and the Irish suffered mightily. The Irish plantation system was the roadmap that the Virginia Company used to settle Virginia. Lands were granted to wealthy courtiers, people with powerful connections, or those who could afford to pay the asking price. England's poor would also be brought over to work on granted lands. The natives would play the Irish sufferer, and Virginia would be a second Ireland. Ultimately, government malfeasance is what sparked the Virginia companies into life. The centuries-long feudalistic monopoly system that made certain merchants wealthy while keeping the rest of the population depressed began to buckle. Tobacco, specifically Caribbean tobacco imported by Spain, provided the fuel that would move English New World colonization forward. King James, who hated the substance and even wrote about it as being wicked, poisonous, and barbaric, realized that the tobacco market was booming. Though he hated tobacco, James could not endure the fact that English money was streaming into Spanish coffers through the Spanish-dominated tobacco trade. To offset the flow of money leaving England, the London merchants bought the right to keep customs and duties made from the tobacco trade. Piggybacking upon this, the merchants were also allowed to work a tax farming scheme, which only served to increase prices across the board, and led to an enormous increase in black market activity. Smuggling now became a huge business in England that involved everyone versus the government and her select few. Parliament in 1604 vocally opposed the new governmental system. They demanded abolishing trade monopolies and wanted free trade in its place. This first pushback, however, was not heeded, which then led to more parliamentary opposition in 1605. This time, the government and monopolists listened, but they were unwilling to dismantle the constraining system. Instead, they attempted to buy the would-be capitalists, but the people refused as they realized the costs vastly outweighed the benefits. Further attempts to force all merchants into London's sphere of influence also backfired, which directly affected those trying to form the Virginia Company. It was the response to the 1605 Parliament that caused the Virginia Company to be split into the London and Plymouth versions. The London version, which is central to the Virginia story, was a collection of various merchants and well-connected officials. Some of the men comprising the business venture were Thomas Smythe, from the East India Company, Bartholomew Gosnold, a friend of Richard Hakluyt the Younger and husband to one of Thomas Smythe's cousins, Edward Maria Wingfield, a cousin of Gosnold's, and an erstwhile George Percy, who had a brother connected to the infamous gunpowder plot. All of the men involved had overseas interests, especially as all of them had either become wealthy from such business or had made a name for himself outside of England. The principal movers lobbied for the king's royal patent, which, in spite of economic issues of the day, James gave on April 10, 1606. By granting the patent, James not only established a trade monopoly to any and all lands settled between modern Cape Fear, North Carolina, and New York, and from sea to sea, but also contributed some government funding by spreading the costs to the already burdened English taxpayer. Though in the long run, such a seemingly beneficial patent would only serve to stifle the early Virginia economy, which will be seen as the story unfolds. James wanted to be sure to benefit from the two Virginia companies. Therefore, he had the Virginia Council created. It was a body of 13 men chosen from both the London and Plymouth ventures. These men were empowered to govern the colonies by enforcing the Crown's law and will, while also earning a tidy business profit. This way it was assumed that both government and private interest would be served in a mercantilist agreement. The Council, along with the continued monopolistic practices sponsored by the Crown, though perhaps not completely understood at the time, could only serve to get both colonies off to a disastrous beginning. But no one thought of failure in the beginning. They only thought of excitement, adventure, profit, and greater opportunities. Their work did raise some interest and money, but it would be Sir John Popham, the Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench, and Sir Robert Cecil, the King's Minister, who most affected the venture's beginning. Both used their influence to turn the most powerful merchants' eyes westward by promising control of goods coming out of the New World, goods that previously could only be had through the increasingly costly Southern European networks. With financial backing secured by the summer 1605 and the royal patent established in April 1606, the London Company moved into organization mode. They quietly began recruiting settlers, which would include a strange mixture of well-seasoned men like the adventurer John Smith, young boys, mostly vagrants or orphans, and higher-class elites like the previously mentioned Edward Maria Wingfield or his cousin Bartholomew Gosnold. Only a few mixtures could have proven more volatile and unworkable. On top of personal tensions, the London Company and the Crown decided to elect a few officials into leadership, but they withheld that information and put it into a box not to be opened until arrival in the New World. Until such arrival, Christopher Newport, a veteran seafarer and captain who had been to the region 20 years before in connection with Roanoke Island, was appointed admiral of the fleet. Much of what happened between April and November is lost to history. Meetings certainly were held, especially one by Thomas Smythe at the offices in Philpot Lane, but the English preferred to keep this venture as secret as possible for fear that the Spanish would discover the plan and destroy the colony in the same way that they had destroyed the French outpost at Fort Caroline. What is certain is that the company leadership grew restless as fall began to give way to winter. If the fleet did not sail soon, they would arrive in Virginia too late to plant crops upon which to live. By late November 1606, the fleet and crew were hastily finalizing plans. Fruit, Water, books, guns, and whatever else was deemed necessary to start a colony was packed aboard the three small vessels, Discovery, Godspeed, and Susan Constant. But before the venture set sail, the Susan Constant, Newport's flagship, was caught in heavy swells alongside a nearby ship, the Philip and Francis. The Susan Constant's experienced crew had warned those aboard the Philip and Francis that their lines were too slack, but the younger crew paid no heed to the warning. When the waves arose, the Philip and Francis swung outward and into the Susan Constant's side, causing minor damage that had to be repaired before a transatlantic journey could begin. After 2.5 weeks, the repairs were complete, and the colony leaders were called upon in order to receive final instructions dictated by Richard Hakluyt the Younger. Christopher Newport was confirmed to be the leader both while sailing to and being ashore in Virginia. This was much to Bartholomew Gosnold and Gabriel Archer's chagrin, because it was they who accomplished so much in making this venture possible. But Newport was chosen by the Crown, not the Virginia Company. A local council was chosen by the company leaders that was to be kept secret until arrival. Gosnold and John Ratcliffe, also known as Sycamore, would be captains of the smaller Godspeed and Discovery, respectively. They were also to find a safe inland port away from heavy forest, while also avoiding swampy regions. They were to separate the men into 4 smaller groups, which would build the main fort, plant crops, build an advanced fort downriver, explore the region, and find minerals, that is, gold. Finally, and this was a central key to the company management, don't provoke the naturals, as they were termed. Instead, establish friendly relations which were conducive to establishing trade relations for the future. With nothing left to coordinate, the party awaited favorable winds, which arrived on December 20th, 1606. The 3 ships ignominiously made their way toward Dover Downs, and then left England, beginning the 144-day journey to Virginia. No fanfare was made, the king was not on the scene. Business as usual continued. But Virginia, England, and the world would never be the same. Though the ships left England, they did not sail far. Weeks of enduring boredom and strong winter storms proved to be too much for the strange mixture of gentlemen and commoners. Cramped quarters kept the men close together throughout the journey, which further agitated already growing tensions. The first conflagration erupted when Edward Maria Wingfield and George Percy believed that a religious plot was being hatched. In their view, the colony's chaplain, Robert Hunt, was the hub of some sort of Catholic conspiracy meant to undermine the settlement. Hunt, who had no idea what Wingfield and Percy thought, suffered from severe seasickness. One experienced traveler came to the chaplain's rescue, John Smith. Smith nursed Hunt through the illness, which, according to Smith, might have taken Hunt's life. Smith and Hunt began to talk about Christian matters, which impressed Smith immensely and led to a solid friendship between the 2 men. But once Hunt was well enough, Wingfield and Percy confronted the supposed papist. Smith was furious in his reply. He accused Wingfield and Percy of being irreligious themselves. Battle lines were vaguely drawn as men lined up behind Smith and Hunt or Wingfield and Percy. Tension was at its highest peak, and then supernaturally at that moment, the winter storm clouds cleared and a comet was seen flashing overhead, after which the winds picked up and the ships began to race westward. For the time being, tensions were eased, though not forgotten. After they reached the Canary Islands, the argument was rejoined. Mutiny was apparently discussed, to which Captain Newport had to step into the fray. He would not tolerate any bombastic display, and John Smith was the king of bombasticism. That being the case, Smith was singled out as the ringleader and thrown into prison. Other than a brief respite, he would remain there until late May 1607. Meanwhile, the fleet continued westward, sighting Martinique and the West Indies on March 23, 1607, and continued sailing the usual route through the Caribbean Sea. They stopped for a week on Guadeloupe in order to refresh themselves after being at sea for more than 2 solid months. While on the island, Newport released Smith, and the men toured the island, even climbing an active volcano, the Grande Soufriere, while also collecting enough supplies to make the final push toward Virginia. Though the setting was peaceful and relaxing, Smith once again proved to be a lit fuse amongst powder kegs. Tensions arose once again, and Newport had to put Smith back in prison on the Susan Constant. The fleet sailed again on April 3rd, but supplies remained scarce. After anchoring near St. Kitts, the Virgin Islands, and then Puerto Rico, the men could no longer endure the fetid water aboard the ships. They had to disembark near Mona, Puerto Rico to search for water, which they found, as well as other food. But the expedition was strenuous in the tropical heat. One Edward Brooks, apparently a fat man according to George Percy's account, fell prey to the heat and died on the island. Others were also so fatigued that after the men reboarded the ships, the fleet did not set sail for another 2 days. Soon the fleet began nearing Florida, and Newport began sounding for the North American continental shelf. But he never found it. 10 days passed, which unnerved the hopeful colonizers. No news in this case was bad news. Newport admitted eventually that he was lost on April 21st, which prompted many to call for a return voyage home before their scant provisions were exhausted. Before that decision was made, however, Robert Tyndall asked to try cutting-edge navigational techniques that most English seamen did not trust. Tyndall used an astrolabe and staff to judge the fleet's position. He then reasoned that they were about 37 degrees north latitude, the apparent latitude of the Chesapeake Bay. After such calculations, Tyndall said to sail west. The ships should arrive at their destination shortly. If only it would have been that easy. On the evening of April 21st, a violent storm erupted, which hammered the fleet for the entire night. The following morning, Newport returned to sounding for shallower waters. Nothing. 3 more days. Nothing. Calls for the return voyage were now becoming louder. Then, just before the sun was about to rise at 4 a.m., the night watch aboard the Susan Constant spotted what looked like a thick carpet of trees on the horizon. After a few more hours of westward sailing, the settlers arrived where Tyndall said they would, at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Once within distance, the excited seafarers came ashore on the northern bend of what is now modern-day Virginia Beach. They named the cape after James's 13-year-old son, Henry, and it still bears the name Cape Henry today. A 30-man strong party remained on land for many hours as they gathered as much information as they could about their surroundings. Nothing more than, quote, goodly tall trees and fresh running waters, as George Percy wrote, were seen. So the English decided by nightfall that this would not meet the required standards for settlement and began to return to their ships. Just as they were preparing to row back to the ships, the settlers were met by Indians creeping on all fours, who suddenly and furiously charged the English. The English beat as hasty a retreat as they could in their shallop, but not before Gabriel Archer was injured by arrows striking both of his hands, and Matthew Morton, a sailor along for the voyage, was also seriously wounded. But they suffered no fatal injuries. Aside from this encounter, the men were happy to have arrived in Virginia. But how long would that emotion last? Thank you for your continued support of the Virginia History Podcast. If you like what is being produced, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, like us on Facebook, and visit the website at vahistorypodcast.com. Please join me again when we cover events after the English arrival at Cape Henry, other Indian encounters, and the establishment of James Fort.
Todo bate despedido dos embazes.